In 1921, a group led by British explorers left Darjeeling to map a hidden mountain pass in the Himalayas. 11 men carried maps, cameras, and rope into the high valleys. At first, everything seemed normal. There were snow fields, cold nights, and steady climbing. Then they found footprints that were too big for any person. They saw cairns that marked forbidden land and heard the sound of heavy footsteps outside their tents at night. By the end, only one man came back alive to tell what happened. So before we continue, please make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. We left Darjeeling in late spring and reached the high valleys after traveling slowly for a month. Snow still lay in shaded gullies. The wind rose in thin bursts and cut through our clothes and wool without stopping. Our group had 11 people at the start. Major Harrington carried a neat notebook and field glasses. Mr. Cartwright was a naturalist with a case full of small bottles. Dr. Bose carried a medical kit and looked serious. Dorje was our main guide. Pemba and Searing were strong men from the valley. Mingma was our cook. There were 3 other porters and me with survey equipment and an old camera. We had a permit stamped at a frontier office and promises, but paper felt small in that country. We were heading for a high cirque beyond a glacier north of the main ridge, where an old monk had told Dorje about a lost pass and a line of stones that marked a forgotten route. Harrington wanted a route that might help a later climb. Cartwright wanted fur, footprints, and bones of anything rare. I had a simple goal that fit inside a notebook: map what we crossed, reach the cirque, and come home safely. The air got thinner day by day, and each step was hard on the lungs. We moved at a careful pace and kept the loads light, but by noon the men chewed dried apricots and spoke little. The first monastery we passed stood on a ledge that faced a ring of peaks. A line of prayer flags snapped in the wind. An old man came out and touched his forehead to Dorje's. He looked at the major and at me without smiling. Dorje translated. The man said the higher valley had a presence that watched. He said hunters went missing in storms that didn't touch the lower slopes. Harrington thanked him and offered tea. The man refused the tin and walked back inside with a look that didn't linger on us. I felt a small pressure in my chest that didn't come from the altitude. The trail rounded a black moraine and entered a basin of dirt and ice. Our boots sank half an inch with each step. Patches of lichen mapped the stones. A hare jumped out from behind a boulder and ran across our path without changing speed. Cartwright pointed out a line of blue sheep far up on a ridge, then wrote in his book. By late afternoon, we reached a shelf near a frozen lake. The wind stopped. The cold took hold at once. Mingma lit the stove. We ate rice and tea and a small portion of yak meat. The sky looked hard and without clouds. I slept in my sleeping bag and had no dreams. In the morning, Dorje found footprints under a crust near the water's edge. They were wide and set more than a man's stride apart. The edges showed detail the way fresh marks do. The pad showed a deep heel and 5 clear toes. The walk looked steady, not a run. Harrington crouched down and measured. He made a sketch. He said it could be a bear that had placed its front foot and back foot together, making a double mark. Dorje didn't answer. Pemba looked at the ridgeline and tightened his scarf. Cartwright asked for plaster. We had none. The sun rose and the footprints softened and lost their shape. We moved on. Midday brought thin clouds over the peaks and dry snow on the wind. The path climbed past a frozen waterfall where green ice showed in bands. Searing pointed to a rock wall where small cairns stood at intervals. They were old with lichen on the stones. A line of them led toward the upper basin. Dorje said the cairns marked forbidden ground. He asked for an offering. Harrington placed a coin under a stone. I placed a strip of cloth that had been used as a bandage. The men added rice grains. We walked between the cairns without speaking. The air grew still in a way that didn't match the weather lower down. By dusk, we reached the first of the upper meadows, but it had no grass, only broken slate and pale dirt. We pitched 2 tents for the Europeans and one for the men with a cooking shelter made from canvas and poles. The stove gave weak heat. We each kept a cup of tea close to our chest to warm our hands before sleep. That night, a sound moved through the camp. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. It came from beyond the ridge above us. It had a steady tone with a low rumble, like wind caught in a pass, but the wind was quiet. The tone rose and fell without pattern. Mingma's eyes widened. Dorje listened and said nothing. In the early light, I checked the ridge with the field glasses. The lens shook a little from the cold in my hands. Nothing moved on the skyline. The snowfield above us looked firm. We crossed it roped in pairs. Harrington took the lead with Dorje. I followed with Cartwright. The rope ran clean through the snow, except where it caught small drifts. We reached a notch and looked down into a bowl of blue ice. The bowl held rocks from a rockfall that had torn a slope on the far side. Near the center lay a smashed prayer wheel, the kind set on a post that turns with the wind. No post stood nearby. The cylinder lay crushed and cold. The letters on the metal were scratched. We cut steps across the bowl and reached the far side. The slope above the break had a shelter made of stone slabs. The roof had sagged. Inside we found 3 yak skulls and a small hearth of blackened stones. On the ground lay a child's leather shoe with a cracked sole. Cartwright turned it over and placed it back. No bedding, no tools, no pots. A faint smell of musk hung in the air. It wasn't fresh, but it clung. Dorje stood at the entrance and watched the slope above us with full attention. Pemba traced a sign on the ground with his finger and covered it with dirt. We set up camp in a hollow out of the wind. Harrington had us circle the tents with a rope set with small bells. He said it would warn us of prowlers, whether wolf or person. The men agreed. In the night, the bells didn't ring. A weight fell on the air near dawn and woke me. It felt like the way a door closes in a tight room. I heard footsteps in the snow outside. One, then a pause, then one. The bells made no sound. I held my breath and counted to 60. The steps moved away toward the ridge. I unzipped the flap and looked out. The surface looked smooth. A shadow drifted over the snow and vanished when a cloud moved. When the sun cleared the ridge, we found a single footprint near the rope line, pressed into the crust as if a heavy thing had set down its foot with care. The toes showed again. The heel sank deep. Harrington looked for marks from claws and found none. He set his jaw and told us to pack. He said we should reach the cirque by evening and not stay here where broken stone made a poor camp. The men moved fast and spoke in short phrases. I felt the urge to check the footprint every few minutes, as though it might change when I looked away. The path narrowed into a gully with walls of broken rock. Frost had split the rock apart. We moved in single file while small stones trickled down at our steps. Halfway through, Tsering hissed and lifted his hand. Above us on the right wall, a dark shape pulled back from the rim. It didn't break rocks loose as it moved. The shadow went flat and then was gone. Harrington called up in a steady voice in Nepali and English. He said we wished to pass. He said we had food and tea to share. No answer came. Dorje set us moving again without stopping. My mouth felt dry, though I had been chewing snow. We reached the upper basin under a ceiling of white cloud. The cirque rose in 3 levels of ice and rock. At its center stood a stone platform waist-high built from flat blocks. On the top lay a ring of bones bleached to a pale color. They weren't all from the same animal. A spindle of wood stood at the center with a cord hanging from it, frayed at the end. Cartwright reached for the bones and stopped when Dorje spoke a single word. We circled the platform. On the far side, the snow had a line drawn with ash. The line ran from the platform toward a crack in the back wall. The ash had drifted, but still formed a trail. We followed the ash to the crack. A cold current moved through it, steady and without smell. The gap led into a narrow passage. On the left wall, someone had scratched marks where a hand would reach. Each mark had 3 parallel lines, spaced the width of 2 fingers. The floor of the passage had no footprints. The wind didn't reach inside. We stood in the opening and listened. From deep within came a sound of slow breathing that didn't match our own. Harrington raised a hand for silence and held it in the air for a long moment. When he lowered it, he looked older. He said we wouldn't enter without a plan and a guard on the camp. We returned to the basin and set the tents near a bent boulder that gave a break from the wind. Harrington laid out the plan in a few words. 2 would stay to guard the camp with the bell rope and the stove. 4 would scout the lower shelves for a safe exit if we had to leave in a hurry. The others, led by Dorje, would enter the crack with lamps, rope, and my camera. He put me with Dorje. I didn't argue. The choice felt right and wrong at the same time. I checked the camera and the spare plates. My hands shook less once the work began. I felt the slow rise of pressure that asked for action and answers. We checked the ropes and lamps while Mingma boiled water. Dorje stood apart and watched the crack. He chewed a strip of dried meat without looking at it. Harrington assigned Searing and 1 porter to guard duty. He told them to keep the stove lit. and to strike the bell line with a stick each hour. He gave Cartwright the scouting team with Pemba and 2 others to trace a retreat route. He told us to be back before dark, or to turn around if the air changed. His voice carried no show of doubt. I packed the camera plates in felt and tied them in a wrap. My breath misted the surface. I told myself to stop thinking and step forward. We entered the crack in single file with Dorje in front, then me, then Mingma with an extra lamp and tea, then another man from the porter crew who had asked to come. He looked at the ground as he walked and kept the rope loose but ready. The stone walls narrowed until our shoulders brushed them. The light smoothed into a low glow. The air felt colder than outside. It had no taste of smoke. The floor rose in small steps cut by water long ago. In places, the rock had a dull shine where hands had rubbed it. The breathing we had heard from the entrance faded, then returned from a side passage, then faded again. It made me think of tides, though I knew it wasn't water. Dorje raised his hand and pointed to a shelf in the left wall. A length of hide had been wedged there, hard and dry. It had coarse hair that didn't match yak. The color was between brown and gray. Cartwright would have had a name for it. We had left him outside. I took one plate from the wrap and set the camera on the tripod. The light was low, so I opened the lamp and cupped it with a hand to aim it. The hair showed thick outer strands and finer underhair. I took the picture and slid the plate into the case. My fingers tingled from the cold on the brass. The passage bent and widened. A flat space appeared with a circular pit at its center. The edge had been lined with stones. Inside lay ash and bone chips. Someone had burned offerings or trash here. Dorje crouched down and sifted the ash with a twig. He found small seeds split by heat. He held them up and shook his head. Mingma leaned over the pit and frowned. He said the seeds belonged to a plant that grew far lower. He looked uneasy. I noted the fact and felt the edge of it push into my thoughts. Whatever used this place moved across wide areas. It brought things up here that didn't belong. We heard a knock from ahead. Not sharp, more a dull strike. Dorje motioned for the porter to hold the back while we moved forward 3 steps. The knock came again, spaced by a steady pause. We turned a corner and found a slab with a notch where it had been moved aside many times. Beyond it lay a room with a low ceiling. The floor had marks where something heavy had been dragged. At the far end, a curtain made from woven grass hung across a niche. The grass had dried and cracked. Dorje whispered a short prayer under his breath. He crossed the floor, lifted the curtain with his pole, and looked into the niche. He called me over without raising his voice. Inside the niche lay a pile of objects. 2 wooden bowls with soot on the rims, a twisted bracelet of hammered copper, a child's cap with a faded tassel, a small drum with the skin worn through, and strips of parchment tied with cord. I took out the camera again and worked in silence. The plate slid in with a smooth click. I shot the niche, then the drag marks, then the slab with the notch. The sound of the camera shutter in that closed space seemed too loud. I felt each picture as a choice I couldn't reverse. We didn't touch the parchment. Dorje said we would bring Cartwright later to read any marks. He said to move on while the light held. We left the room and took the right-hand tunnel that sloped up. The air grew stiller. Our breath sounded close. A faint smell came to us, a mix of musk and damp stone. Another 30 steps brought a second room, taller, with a vent in the ceiling where a crack let in a thread of daylight. Under the vent stood a heap of animal skins. They had been stacked with care. The top skin had marks where teeth had pressed. Not bite marks from feeding, more the pressure of a jaw testing. I raised the camera and stopped when Dorje touched my sleeve. He pointed to a pebble near the heap. A hair lay across it, pale and fine. It shifted as the air moved from the vent. It was long, longer than any human hair I had seen. We heard a scrape behind us. The porter at the back called out in a low voice that something had moved near the slab room. Dorje signaled to put out one lamp. We stood with 3 lamps turned down until they gave a dim glow. Silence filled the passage. The scrape didn't come again. My back muscles tightened and then relaxed. I thought of the bell rope at camp and wished I could hear it. It would have meant distance and order. The thought passed. We had work in front of us. We pushed on and reached a narrow bridge of rock over a dark cut. The width allowed 1 foot at a time. We passed without trouble, and the tunnel opened into a gallery with ledges at different heights. On each ledge lay stones arranged in patterns. Some formed spirals, others squares. In one place, pebbles had been sorted by color from pale to dark in a row that curved along the wall. I felt a change in my chest as I looked at them. This wasn't random. Mingma asked if shepherd children could have done this. Dorje shook his head. He said no child would wander here. He warned us not to change anything. At the end of the gallery, we found an opening to the outside, small and round, cut by frost and time. Through it, we saw a notch in the ridge and a stretch of sky. The light showed the hour was past noon. Snow drifted across the opening and melted on the stone edge. Below the hole, the rock had been worn by hands and feet. We had reached a lookout point. Dorje leaned out and scanned the basin. He stiffened. He told us to come one by one and look to the right of the tents. I saw a figure standing near the bent boulder. It faced the camp and didn't move. The shape looked tall and wide across the shoulders. The fur lay close to the body and didn't flap. I couldn't see the face. The men at camp hadn't noticed it. The stove smoke went straight up. The figure stood and watched. Then it turned its head and looked toward our opening. The motion was slow and deliberate. I felt caught. My throat tightened. I pulled back and met Dorje's eyes. He had seen the same. He said we would leave at once and return with the others together, or not at all. We went back over our steps with care. The patterns in the gallery stayed as we had found them. The bridge took us one at a time. The slab room looked the same as before, but the curtain had been moved. It now hung crooked as if brushed by a heavy shoulder. The ash pit had no new marks. We passed the hide on the ledge. I kept the camera wrapped. My mind wanted to record more, but speed mattered. At the entrance to the crack, the light reached us and brought the cold back to the skin. We stepped into the basin and saw Cartwright with Pemba at the rope. Tsering stood by the stove with the stick. Their faces told us enough. They had seen movement. Harrington came from behind the boulder with the field glasses in his hand. He asked what we had found. Dorje answered in short points. Niche objects, skins, hair, gallery, figure at the camp watching. Harrington's mouth went thin. He said we wouldn't split up again. He ordered the bell rope doubled, and the tents moved closer to the boulder. He told Cartwright to write a list of what we had seen, and then to start packing plates and notes so we could move in the morning. The men worked fast. I helped move the tents, while Dorje and Pemba walked a circle around the camp to read the snow. They found footprints that came from the slope and ended near the boulder. The stride changed. In some places, the toes had gripped the crust and left ridges. The tracks avoided the bell rope by inches. Tsering said the figure had stood within spitting distance for more than a minute. He had felt it in his back before he turned and saw it. He hadn't struck the bell because it made no sense to call it closer. He spoke without dressing up the memory. By dusk, the wind returned from the north. The stove stuttered and caught again. Harrington called us close. He said we had likely walked into a place that held importance for those who lived here, whether men or something outside that word. He said we would show respect and leave. He said we wouldn't light a large fire and would speak quietly. He set watches of 2 men with an hour on and an hour off. He told us to sleep in our outer clothes. His manner had changed. He didn't try to explain the bell staying silent when the footsteps came the night before. He didn't insist it was a bear. In the first watch, I sat with Dorje under the shelter of the boulder. The stove gave a faint glow. Snow hissed as it hit the canvas. Across the basin, the crack lay dark and empty. The sky showed a single star near the notch. Dorje told me his grandfather had worked as a trader and had once passed near this valley. He said the old man had carried salt and tea and had turned back when he saw stones arranged on a shelf low on the ground. He hadn't explained why he turned back. He had never returned by that path again. Dorje said he thought of that story when the old monk spoke at the first monastery. Then he fell silent. Near midnight, the bells murmured without ringing. The rope shook. We all woke. No one spoke. The sound came from beyond the boulder. It wasn't the breathing from the crack. It was slower and heavier. The rope moved again and then went still. Tsering stood with the stick ready but didn't strike. The snow outside the line looked unmarked. When the sound stopped, a small stone rolled from the top of the boulder and tapped the ground. It hadn't fallen from wind. I felt the camp draw in on itself. I breathed through my nose and counted to steady my hands. I kept my eyes on the place where the rope had moved. The night passed one thin slice at a time. At first light, we found the stone that had rolled into camp. It wasn't from the basin floor, but from higher up the slope, dark and smooth from glacier polish. Harrington set it aside and said nothing. Dorje and Pemba traced fresh footprints that circled the camp and ended at a cluster of rocks. From there, the snow showed only the sweep of a body sliding down to the ice, as if something had lowered itself with care. The sight pushed silence over the group. Cartwright broke it by asking if the footprints matched the earlier ones. Dorje said they did. The stride and shape hadn't changed. The toes had pressed deeper this time. We ate in a hurry. Mingma burned extra tea leaves in the pot for warmth. Harrington ordered us to break camp at once. He said we would take the retreat path that Cartwright had scouted. The men pulled at the ropes and folded canvas without a word. My hands moved out of habit, tying knots, wrapping plates, storing gear. Inside, I kept thinking of the figure by the boulder and how it had turned its head toward our lookout point. It had known we were watching. That thought clung more than the cold. The retreat path led down a narrow chute between ice walls. The snow crust broke under our boots and we sank to the knee. The rope kept us together. At one point, a slab of ice cracked and slid a foot. Searing steadied the line and swore. When we reached a wide shelf, the sky cleared for a moment, showing a high ridge with a snow overhang ready to break. Harrington chose a line along the base where avalanche debris had already fallen. He said the slope had spent its weight. I felt each step drag with the thought of what still hung above us. Halfway across, Pemba froze and pointed upslope. On the ridge, just below the overhang, a shape stood clear against the snow. It didn't move. It looked down at us without hurry. Dorje hissed at the men to keep walking. He said not to stop. We kept the rope tight and crossed the debris field one slow step at a time. I could feel eyes on us the whole way. When we reached the far side, I looked back. The shape was gone. No collapse, no slide, only absence. By midday, we reached a hollow with a frozen stream and stopped to rest. The air here felt thicker, easier to breathe. The men dropped their loads and sat in silence. Cartwright opened his notebook and wrote fast, as though afraid the details would slip away. He asked Dorje what the locals called the figure. Dorje looked at the ground and said only one word, Yeti. He spoke it without force, as if it needed no weight. Harrington scowled and told him to keep such names out of the report. He said we needed facts, not stories. Dorje met his eye but said nothing more. We pushed on into the lower valley. The wind shifted and carried a faint smell, sharp and musky, the same as in the room. It clung to the air long after we left the hollow. That evening we made camp by a line of old cairns. The stones leaned with age. Harrington said they would mark our progress. Dorje warned us not to move them. We tied the bell rope again. I tried to rest, but the smell still filled my nose. When I did sleep, I dreamed of the gallery of stones arranged in spirals and of hands sorting pebbles by color. The bells rattled once during the night. Harrington and Searing ran out with lamps. They found footprints close to the rope, 2 sets this time, side by side. The snow showed weight pressed deep. One stride crossed the other. We couldn't tell if they had arrived together or if one had followed the other. Harrington cursed and struck the snow with the end of his field glasses. He said we would double the pace at dawn. He told us to pack in the dark and leave before first light. The next day, the men moved fast as though driven. The rope line pulled tight. We went down through a forest of rhododendron. The branches were bare of leaves at this height. The trunks twisted and left gaps wide enough for shadows to pass. Cartwright stopped at one point and bent over a branch. He showed us coarse hair caught in the bark. The strands were pale, almost white. He put them in his pocket before Harrington could object. The sight brought no relief. If anything, it pressed heavier on us. Whatever followed could move through trees as well as stone. Late in the day, a storm came down. Snow fell in thick flakes. The trail vanished under our boots. Dorje led with a pole, poking for hollows. The men whispered prayers under their breath. We stumbled into a stand of fir trees and made shelter with the canvas between trunks. The stove barely lit. Smoke drifted low and made our eyes water. We huddled in our sleeping bags. The wind howled above us, but under the trees it stayed close and muffled. I closed my eyes and thought of the shoe in the room niche and of the copper bracelet. Someone had lived in that crack once or left their dead there. The thought unsettled me more than the storm. In the night, I woke to a sound of wood creaking, At first I thought it was branches bending under snow. Then I heard a snap, sharp and deliberate from beyond the stove's glow. I reached for my lamp. A shadow crossed between the trunks, tall and wide, gone in a blink. I held my breath. A moment later, another shape passed in the opposite direction. The snow muffled their steps, but the weight carried through the ground. I felt it in my chest more than I heard it. I didn't dare move. I counted until the blood roared in my ears. When at last I slept again, I dreamed of heavy eyes fixed on me from the dark. At dawn, the storm had thinned, but the camp looked trampled. Snow around the trees had wide footprints that circled us in loops. Some footprints overlapped, but the depth showed more than one weight. The bell rope hung loose, the knots untied as if picked apart by fingers. Harrington examined the rope in silence, his lips pressed flat. No man in our group would have wasted time untying knots in a storm. We broke camp with stiff hands. The men moved fast, heads down, saying little. The descent path led to a gorge where ice hung from the cliffs. Meltwater dripped and froze again in ridges. The floor of the gorge was narrow and boxed in. Dorje put us in 2 lines so we could move faster. The sound of water echoed close, but above that came another noise, faint and steady. A low call, too deep for wind, too long for an animal. It repeated 3 times, each time closer. Searing crossed himself and gripped the pole harder. Harrington raised the field glasses, but the cliff showed nothing. We hurried on. My breath came rough from fear more than climbing. When we reached the end of the gorge, the sound stopped. The valley beyond opened wide. A frozen river lay across it, flat and grey. We chose the far bank for camp, a slope of stone that gave some shelter from wind. The stove smoked, but no warmth stayed. Mingma cooked rice without words. Cartwright pulled the white hairs from his pocket and laid them on a plate to study. They were longer than my hand. The strands looked too coarse for human hair, too fine for yak. He tried to measure, but Harrington snapped at him to put them away. He said we had no time for specimens, only for survival. That night the watch fell to me and Dorje. The moon rose behind clouds, dim and hazy. We sat near the stove with lamps dimmed. The snowfield across the river shone faint. Dorje touched my sleeve and pointed. A line of shapes moved slowly along the far bank. I counted 3, tall, wide, spaced far apart. They walked with a steady walk, heads bent low. We watched in silence until they reached the end of the river bend and vanished behind rock. Dorje leaned close and whispered that they wouldn't stop now. His voice carried no doubt. At dawn, Harrington decided we wouldn't follow the main track down the valley, but cut across the ridge to the south. He said the river path would make us visible. Dorje argued that the ridge would slow us, but Harrington insisted. We began the climb. The slope rose steep and had loose stone under snow. Twice men slipped and slid back. By noon, clouds closed in and hid the peaks. We moved in a grey world with only rope and breath to show us where we were. Then a cry broke through the cloud, high and sharp, nothing like the deep calls from before. It came from just ahead on the ridge. We froze. A shadow passed through the mist, fast and sudden. Stones rattled down. The porter at the back shouted. We turned and saw him struggling. Something had grabbed his pack. The rope pulled tight. The pack tore free, spilling gear down the slope. The shadow vanished into the cloud above. The man fell to his knees, shaking. His eyes were wide and wet. He said nothing, only held onto the rope as though it alone kept him alive. We pushed on, shaken. The pack and what was in it were lost. The stove was in it. We reached a saddle by dusk and built a poor camp with no fire, only cold food. The men huddled close. Harrington tried to give orders, but his voice had lost its force. Cartwright spoke instead. He said what we had seen couldn't be dismissed as bear or trick. He said the gallery of stones showed thought, not chance. He said the figures on the river moved with purpose. His words broke something in the group. The men muttered. Some wanted to turn back, some to keep going. Harrington shouted them down, but the shouts had no weight. In the night, I woke to low growls, not animal growls, but drawn-out sounds from more than one throat. They came from both sides of the ridge. Snow slid from above in sheets. The ground shook. I crawled out of the tent and saw 2 shapes on the ridge, black against the cloud, standing still. Then one lifted its head and gave a call that rolled across the valley. The sound froze me more than the cold. It told us we weren't leaving unnoticed. At dawn, no footprints remained on the crest. The snow had covered them. Harrington ordered us to move without food, without tea. We went down the south slope into a forest of pine trees. The air smelled of sap and damp earth. The ground showed no snow here, only needles and moss. For a time I thought we had escaped. Then Pemba stopped and raised his hand. Ahead on a fallen tree trunk lay the copper bracelet we had seen in the room niche. It hadn't been in any of our packs. It lay clean on the bark, waiting. The men pulled back. Mingma muttered that it had been carried and placed for us. Harrington cursed and kicked it into the brush, but the act gave no relief. We marched on. I kept looking back. The trees closed in. The air grew thick. I heard twigs snap behind us, never near, always just beyond sight. The forest wasn't empty. We knew it, and we knew we wouldn't outrun it for long. We kept moving through the pine trees until our legs buckled under us. Harrington finally called a stop in a hollow, where boulders gave cover on three sides. The men dropped their loads in silence. No one dared gather wood. We chewed dry grain and drank melted snow from the folds of our coats. Hunger pressed on us, but no one complained. Each man kept glancing toward the trees. I thought often of the bracelet on the trunk. That it had followed us from the crack to the forest meant more than following. It meant purpose. Cartwright broke the quiet. He said aloud what we all carried in our thoughts. He said these beings weren't beasts, but people of some kind living beyond sight, keeping their land secret. He said their acts, laying stones, leaving objects, were signs of order, not instinct. Harrington told him to hold his tongue. He said to suggest such things was to give in to fear. Yet Harrington's hand trembled as he wrote in his notebook. I saw the ink trail crooked when the pen caught the page. His eyes were dull, the firm look gone. At dusk, Tsering struck the bell rope as ordered, but the sound rang flat. The men turned their heads as one. In the trees beyond the hollow, something moved. Not one, but many, shifting in and out of view between trunks. Wide shoulders, arms that hung long, bodies taller than ours. I counted 4, maybe 5 before the trees swallowed them. They didn't come closer. They circled. I felt my mouth dry. Harrington whispered to keep still. No panic, no shouts. We sat through the night with the rope tight in our hands. The shapes never entered, but they stayed. I knew they were watching until the first pale light pushed through the branches. When morning came, the men refused to move at once. Dorje said the path south would take us to a village in 3 days if we kept pace, but the men shook their heads. They said we wouldn't last 3 days with shadows at our heels. Harrington tried to argue, but his voice cracked. Pemba spoke for the others. He said we should leave gifts and turn back east to where the valleys opened wider. He said the spirits would let us go if we showed respect. Cartwright agreed, though for a different reason. He said they weren't spirits, but beings who guarded their land and that trespassers must pay. We gathered what little we could spare, a knife, a wool scarf, a tin cup, a string of beads, a strip of dried meat. We laid them on a stone at the hollow's edge. Dorje whispered words low and clear, words I didn't know but felt in the chest. The air stilled, no sound of birds, no crack of branches. The silence grew until it hurt. Then from deep in the trees came a short call, low and rough. Once, then nothing. Georgie nodded and told us to move east. The men obeyed. Harrington bit his lip but didn't stop them. We crossed a low ridge and entered a gorge where water had cut the rock. The walls pressed close, the air damp and heavy. I walked near the back. The rope pulled hard at times, men eager to be free. Then a cry rang out from above the gorge. Not the deep call, but sharp, violent, cutting through stone. A shadow dropped onto the path ahead. It landed in silence, though its weight cracked ice beneath it. It rose to its full height, wide chest, arms that swung long, hair pale gray against the rock, eyes dark and set deep. It stared at us without sound. The men froze. No one drew steel. Harrington stepped forward with his hand raised. His lips moved with words I couldn't hear. The figure stood still. Then another dropped behind us. The rope went tight. I turned and saw the second. Darker in hair, thicker in build, its breath rising in clouds. We were boxed in. The air thickened with fear. I felt my knees weaken. My mind shouted to run, but the gorge walls held us trapped. The first one gave a sound like a bark, short and final. It took a step closer, slow and measured. Harrington shouted now, voice breaking, calling it beast, calling it nothing but animal. His hand went to his pistol. Dorje grabbed his arm and held it down. Harrington fought him, red in the face, the figure's eyes fixed on him. The silence after the shout felt endless. Then the second figure moved, circling closer. Their steps made no sound but pressed the earth. Cartwright cried out for us to leave the gifts again. He fumbled in his coat for the hairs he had taken, the notebook, the vial. He held them out with shaking hands. The first figure turned its head toward him. It stepped back. The second followed. Without another sound, they both climbed the gorge wall, pulling themselves up with impossible ease, vanishing into mist. We stood frozen long after. Dorji finally hissed for us to move. We stumbled forward without order, tripping over rocks, breath rough. The men looked broken, eyes hollow. Harrington walked last, lips moving, notebook clutched, pistol holstered. No one spoke to him. That night we found a meadow with low grass and streams free of ice. The men dropped and lay still. We didn't tie the rope. We didn't light the stove. The silence of the gorge had followed us here. I felt the weight of eyes even in the open. I knew they could follow if they wished. I wondered if they had allowed us to live, or if they only waited for us to break. I stared at the stars until my eyes closed against my will. When I woke, I heard nothing. No men stirring, no breathing near me. The meadow lay still. My stomach clenched. I sat up fast. Only Dorje remained by the fire pit, staring at the ground. He said nothing when I asked. His eyes told me enough. The others were gone. No footprints, no cries, no struggle. Gone. Harrington's notebook lay near the ashes, pages torn free. Cartwright's pack stood open, the hairs gone. The meadow felt empty in a way that tore the heart. Dorje whispered that we weren't meant to take anything, weren't meant to write, weren't meant to return. We left the meadow with no words. The path east led us back toward the settlements. Days later, when stone walls of a village rose before us, we looked back once. The peaks lay under cloud, unmoved by what had passed. Dorje didn't step into the village with me. He turned and walked back toward the ridges. He said he owed a debt. I never saw him again. I reached Darjeeling alone months later. The men were never found. The valley stayed unmapped. The records we carried were taken and sealed. Harrington, Cartwright, Bose, Mingma, Pemba, Tsering, their names stayed only in my memory. What followed us in the high places had claimed them. I survived, but I carried the weight of their absence and the knowledge that something greater than us guarded the heights.